can one coincide without the other? So could you live purely based on logic without emotion? And could you purely live on emotion without logic?
No.
Why not?
No. It's not in our nature.
I think you can.
I also think you can, but I want to see why you're saying you can't.
It's not. I feel like there will be people like that because obviously.
So please tell us why you think you can't.
Can't live. One can't coincide. Why do you think one can't coincide without the other?
You can't. Let's say you're 100% logical. You can't interact with anyone if you have no emotional understanding whatsoever. And you're literally made to. You're literally in any society, in any culture, or wherever you're from, as you're raised up. There's no. What's the word? How do I phrase it? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying generally there's no way that you won't have some sort of emotional experience or some sort of emotional thinking as you're growing up. And I feel like generally because of that, I don't think it makes sense that you can somehow just not have that, just not have that anymore once you've grown up. I feel like generally once you have that understanding, it's just always there. And then if you're 100% emotional, generally when you grow up, you start learning stuff and et cetera, and then that's where you get logical thinking from. So I don't think you can just be... When you're 100% emotional, generally you're not making any good decisions. So I don't think it's possible, no. I feel like there are there's obviously gonna be an anomaly or something, but generally I don't think so, no.
Why I think you're wrong, Nolan, is because psychopaths exist. Psychopaths are people that lack any emotional intelligence whatsoever, basically. And they've lacked emotional intelligence from young ages. Like you can tell from a very young age whether a person's a psychopath or not. And they operate just fine. They may not have friends, admittedly. They may not be the most popular people, but they function perfectly in society. They tend to live successful lives. They tend, successful, however you deem success, they then tend to live lives. Some even get married, but you can live purely on logic, like
I agree 100%.
Like a psychopath would, yeah.
And that's why I said
not just people who are psychopaths though. People who have OCD, people who have autism, people who have ADHD, they access a higher percentage of their brain naturally than you and me, right? They tend to not think about things about how they feel. It's not about how they feel. If you've given them a set of rules, they will follow those rules and they won't deviate from that. And the emotion that you think you're seeing is not how they feel. It is not the emotion they are experiencing. It's the emotion you perceive that they are experiencing. That is the difference.
But in what you just said, you still claim that they still feel some sort of emotion.
They might not necessarily be feeling anything. They're just expressing something that you think is emotion. That is not necessarily an emotion to them.
What would you say it is then? What would you say it is then?
What do you mean?
If it's something that we consider an emotion, what if you don't classify it as an emotion, what would you say it is then?
But if they have special needs, there's going to be an attribute that they have that they don't have a control over. They won't have outbursts because they want to have it. It will just naturally happen if logic is not performing the way they want it to, right? If that makes sense. But it's not an emotional outburst is what I'm trying to say. It's just a
reaction to something.
It's a reaction that they can't control because you have said, this is the logic, this is the rules, and this is how they perceive logic is. This is how they believe society should run, or how school should run, or however anything should be done. And you have deviated from that. And they don't like it, or their brain doesn't like it. So they have an outburst. That's kind of, but you will perceive it as like, oh, they're having an emotional meltdown. That is not an emotional meltdown. It's because their brain can't process that you've deviated from their logic.
That's why I said emotions are in our human nature. It's there. The outburst, you're saying the outburst is just the reaction to something not going, the way they logically think it's supposed to happen. But even still, that makes sense to me. And no, I wouldn't say it's an emotional outburst, but an outburst is them expressing themselves, which is what emotions are.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because they're not necessarily gonna.
And you said it was something they can't control, which
they can't control it, but they're not exactly feeling anything either. So you're telling me that you can have emotion and not feel that you're having that emotion.
That does make sense.
Yeah,
that does make sense.
For example, I remember when I first started at my job, there was this boy. Basically, he was in a wheelchair. I think he was autistic as well. And the elevator stopped working in our surgery. And basically, the only way you can get out is by going down the stairs, because our surgery is upstairs. It's weird. Anyway, so he came out of his appointment with his mum, and his mum had to tell him, well, the elevator isn't working, so we're gonna have to go down the stairs. And this boy was in distress. Like, he was screaming. It was awful to watch, horrible. But even though he didn't understand fully what was going on, he wasn't emotional in that sense. He was still distressed. Distress is still an emotion. It still comes from somewhere. It's not to say that, he's not emotional at all, because he might not fully understand or comprehend what's going on, but that distress is still an emotion inside of him. It's just how he interprets it. It's just different. It's not like how, say, somebody else would interpret it. Does that make sense? But it comes from somewhere. It's just not the same.
I think emotions are more complicated than I think we give credit to, right? Because you could be frustrated and be stressed about something, right? But you won't necessarily know sometimes until your body gives you an indication that actually you're probably feeling stressed. That has happened a lot of times, right? For like normal human beings, but you personally won't perceive yourself as, I guess, stressed. But that is kind of like an exception to, like, I guess, the rule. If you were going to argue that point, is that sometimes you won't necessarily know you are. If we're looking at like people who don't have a learning disability, I think it's just, I don't know. I just think that they think more logically than we do.
Maybe, but I think it's not fair. It's not fair for them to think like that. Maybe for that person, maybe for that boy, it wasn't his choice, but it's not fair for anybody to lack emotional intelligence, for anybody to lack thinking logically. It's not fair, but we're all at an imbalance, really and truly.
You think it's not fair?
Nothing we can.
They may not necessarily think like that.
Yeah, which is, they might not understand it that way. But yes, personally, I don't think it's fair for anybody to lack what they should have, what has been given to us as a gift. That's not fair.
I think maybe it also raises the point that there's actually a difference between emotional intelligence and experiencing emotion. Because that boy probably didn't experience that emotion. And he doesn't have the emotional intelligence to know what that emotion is.
Yeah, exactly. But it wasn't fair. It's not fair for him to not understand what's going on inside of him. It's not fair for him to be screaming like that and thinking, okay, the only way for me to get out of this building is to go down the elevator. That's not fair. I mean, yes, there was many other factors in place at that moment, but it wasn't fair. It's not fair for anybody to feel like they can't express their emotion. It's just not fair.
I think it goes back to like what was the original argument? And you said that it's very hard to live without emotion, but there are people that do. And that's kind of what me and Tommy's argument is, right?
But it's not. It's like you said, even if you don't have an understanding of an emotion, or even if you don't feel an emotion the same, you still have them. You could have emotion and it's only giving you, like you said, a physical reaction, and there's no thought process, no nothing. You don't understand anything to do, but you just have that reaction towards it. That's still your body reacting to an emotion, but you might have no understanding whatsoever. But it's still there. That's why I said it does.
I think the question would be, are all your actions guided by emotion? Because an outburst doesn't mean necessarily like I could just scream for the sake of screaming, but it's not guided by any emotion. That I think that's the right?
I think that's what you're trying to argue, Nolan. I think what me and Jasmine are trying to say is that you can fully live your life based purely on logic. And I think what you're trying to say is you're agreeing with us, but disagreeing with us at the same time, which is weird. So I think the overall premise, because we need to wrap this up and move on to Tommy's selections. But the overall premise of what he's saying is that you, in generally, no, you shouldn't be able to live without. You have to have both of them in your life, but there are exceptions to the rule, such as people that are emotionally dull. I think that's what we're trying to say. Am I right?
I'd say like as much as you might think that you lack, emotion, that you think, as much as you might think that you think, logically 100%, or you act logically 100%, that I don't feel like you can, you can think that you do.
No. Psychopaths do not have any I'm telling you this. Psychopaths do not exhibit any emotion.
They pretend to have emotion, but they don't have any.
They pretend to show they have emotion. They have zero emotional intelligence. They show zero emotions whatsoever in their daily lives.
There are people with like extreme cases of OCD that will cry because they know they should cry, not because they want to cry.
Exactly.
They will show emotion because society has dictated that you should in this situation, but they will do it because everyone else is doing it, not because they feel anything or
feel any emotion
they
inside
have sadness or anything like that. They won't do it.
It's purely logical.
Just do it. Yeah. That is this is how I think people can live. That you can tell yourself, be angry that Arsenal lost, right? Because everyone else in your family is angry that Arsenal lost, right? But they don't feel anger. That is our argument.
You could have used a different team, You have to use Arsenal, Liverpool was right there,
But that is how some people, like if you've ever watched the show like about the people who have extreme OCD, but there was a woman on there that would like forced herself to cry because the situation was that everyone else was crying because someone had died in her family, and she was close to this person, but she couldn't cry, she couldn't show emotion, she was just blank. And then she just forced herself to cry because she knew that she should cry in this situation or she should feel sad. So she would say, I am sad, and cry, but she's not actually, if that makes sense.
And that's what me and Jasmine are trying to say.
Understand what you're saying.
Okay. And on that beautiful note, we will end the episode there. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening. And before we wrap up the episode, we will move on to Tommy's selections.